The scaffolding collapsed on a Tuesday morning in October 2003. Marco Benedetti was 52 years old when it happened. He was working on the restoration of a building in the Testaccio district of Rome, the neighborhood where he had lived his entire life. The scaffolding was old, poorly maintained, but the contractor had assured everyone it was safe. Contractors always assured that. Marco remembered the sound. A crack like thunder, then the sensation of falling, then nothing. He fell 30 meters. He hit the pavement hard enough that witnesses said they thought he was dead. His skull fractured in 3 places. His spine was damaged at the lumbar region. He broke both legs, 3 ribs, and his left arm in 2 locations. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The doctors at Ospedale San Camillo said he wouldn't survive the night. When he did, they said he would be a vegetable. When he didn't become a vegetable, they said he would never wake up. Marco woke up 20 years later. His wife Isabella was sitting beside his bed when his eyes opened. She was older then, so much older. Her hair, which had been dark brown when he fell, was now completely grey. Her face was lined with 2 decades of worry and exhaustion. "Marco," she whispered. "Marco, can you hear me?" He couldn't speak. His throat was dry. His body didn't respond to commands. His mind was foggy, like he was waking from a dream that had lasted forever. But he could hear her, and he could see her. And somehow in the confusion of awakening, that was enough. The doctors said it was a miracle. 20 years in a coma, they explained to Isabella and their son, also named Marco, who had flown in from Milan when his father woke up. And he woke up with minimal neurological damage. We don't understand it. Medically, it shouldn't be possible. Marco spent the first week in the hospital simply trying to understand what had happened. The nurses told him it was 2023. 20 years had passed. The world had changed. Technology had advanced. The internet was everywhere. Smartphones existed. Italy was different. Rome was different. Testaccio was different. On the 8th day, when Marco was finally able to speak more than single words, his family explained everything. Isabella had stayed by his side for the first 5 years. She had visited every single day, even when the doctors said there was no point. She had talked to him, held his hand, played music she thought he might enjoy, but life had continued. She had needed to work. She had needed to survive. The medical bills were astronomical. Insurance covered some of it, but not all. She had sold the small house they owned and bought a smaller apartment further from the center. Their son Marco, who had been 22 when his father fell, had graduated from university. He had become an engineer. He had moved to Milan for work. He had married. He had children of his own. Their daughter, Lucia, had been 17. She had struggled in school after the accident. She had gone to university but dropped out. She had gotten married at 19 to a man named Roberto. That marriage had lasted 3 years. She had another daughter now, named Sophia, who was 11 years old. Isabella had been forced to retire early from her job as a teacher due to stress and physical illness. She had been living on a small pension and what little money remained from the sale of their house. "We thought you would never wake up," Isabella told Marco, holding his hand carefully as if he might break. "I prepared myself for you to never wake up. And then you did." Marco tried to process this information. 20 years, 2 decades of his life simply gone, erased. He had been 52. Now he was 72. He had missed the entire life of his grandchildren. He had missed his children's milestones. He had missed everything. The money, Marco managed to say. His voice was hoarse from disuse. "What about money?" "For you?" Isabella shook her head. "There was some compensation from the lawsuit against the construction company, but not much. They claimed the accident was your fault for not checking the scaffolding properly. It took 5 years of legal battles. We got enough to cover some medical bills, but most of it went to lawyers." Marco closed his eyes. This was worse than he thought. On the 14th day, a different visitor came to see Marco. She was a lawyer, a woman in her 60s named Antonella Rossi. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a professional suit despite the warmth of the October afternoon. "Mr. Benedetti," she said, shaking his hand carefully. "So I'm glad to see you're awake. Your wife has been trying to reach me for weeks, but I was traveling. Do I know you?" Marco asked. "No," Antonella responded, "but I know about you." Or rather, I know about an investment you made in 2002. Marco's mind raced. An investment? He had barely had money to invest in anything. He had been a mason, a skilled tradesman but not wealthy. I don't understand, Marco said. Antonella pulled out a folder from her briefcase. Inside were documents yellowed with age, covered in Italian legal language. In 2002, Antonella began, a company called Benedetti and Sons Real Estate Development was formed. You were listed as one of the founding investors, along with your cousin Giuseppe. Marco's mind went blank. Giuseppe. His cousin. He remembered Giuseppe. They had talked about business occasionally, usually after drinking wine at family dinners, but Marco had dismissed it as drunk talk. Giuseppe approached you about investing, Antonella continued. He wanted to buy some land in Testaccio that was being sold by the city. Land that was considered worthless because it was contaminated from old industrial use. He believed that if the land could be cleaned up and developed, it could be valuable. I didn't have money to invest, Marco said. No, you didn't, Antonella agreed. But you had a house. You mortgaged your house and gave Giuseppe 50,000 euros. That was your investment. Marco felt his heart rate increase. He had mortgaged their house? Isabella hadn't mentioned this. What happened to the investment? Marco asked, though he was afraid of the answer. For 15 years nothing happened, Antonella said. The company struggled. Giuseppe was not a good businessman. The land sat there. No development occurred. Then in 2018, the city completed a metro line that passed directly under that land. Antonella pulled out more documents. Suddenly, the land became valuable, very valuable. Developers saw the potential. In 2020, the land was sold to a major development company for 14 million euros. Your share as a 50-50 partner with Giuseppe was 7 million euros. Minus taxes and legal fees, your net amount is approximately 5 million euros. Marco could not speak. 5 million euros. 5 million euros that had been sitting in an account, accumulating while he lay in a coma. 5 million euros that he had never known about because Giuseppe had never told him, apparently assuming Marco would never wake up. The money has been in trust, Antonella continued. Since you were in a coma and unable to manage it, Giuseppe arranged for it to be placed in a trust account. He has been the trustee, but now that you're awake, the money becomes accessible to you. Where is Giuseppe? Marco asked. He died in 2019, Antonella said. A heart attack. So the trust is now in your name, but his heirs have been receiving the interest accumulated over the years. We need to sort that out legally. Marco closed his eyes. When Marco told Isabella about the money, she didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply stared at him for a long moment, then got up and walked to the window. 5 million euros, she said. Not turning around. Yes, Marco confirmed. And Giuseppe has been collecting interest on this money while we struggled to pay your medical bills, Isabella said, her voice very quiet. According to the lawyer, his heirs have been collecting interest, Marco corrected. Isabella turned to face him. Do you understand what we sacrificed? She asked. I worked 60-hour weeks. I stopped visiting you after the first 5 years because I was so exhausted. I had to choose between taking care of you and keeping a roof over our heads. I got rid of everything we owned. Every nice thing we had I sold. And you had 5 million euros sitting in an account the entire time. I didn't know, Marco said, and it sounded inadequate even to his own ears. I know you didn't know, Isabella said, and there were tears in her eyes now. But the money existed. And Giuseppe knew, and he never told us. He let us suffer while he was getting rich off of your investment. She sat back down, but not beside him. She sat on the other side of the room. What are we going to do? She asked. We'll get the money, Marco said. We'll get the money, and we'll use it to fix things. You can't fix 20 years, Isabella said quietly. After 2 months of rehabilitation, Marco was discharged from the hospital. He was weak. His muscles had atrophied from 2 decades of disuse. He needed a walker to move around. His speech was still sometimes slurred. His left side, which had been more severely injured, still had limited mobility. But he was alive. And he was conscious. And he was going home. The apartment was not the home he remembered. The house they had owned in Testaccio had been sold years ago. Isabella had purchased a small 2-bedroom apartment further from the center, in a less desirable neighborhood. The building was old, the walls were thin, the plumbing was unreliable, but it was the best Isabella could do with limited money. Now, with the 5 million euros becoming accessible, they could move. They could buy a real house again. They could have the life they had lost. Except Isabella didn't want to talk about moving. "Let's just stay here," she said when Marco suggested it. "This is where I've been living. This is what I've gotten used to." "We can get something better," Marco said. "We can get the house back." We can't get back what we lost," Isabella interrupted. "And moving to a nicer house won't change that." Marco realized for the first time that the money was not going to fix his marriage. 20 years is a long time to be gone. Isabella had become a different person in his absence. She had hardened. She had learned to live without him. And while she was glad he was alive, there was a distance between them now that money couldn't bridge. Marco took walks through Testaccio, slowly with his walker, trying to recognize his old neighborhood. It was unrecognizable. The narrow streets, he remembered, were now lined with trendy restaurants and boutique shops. The old working-class bars where he used to drink wine had been replaced with expensive cafes. The small grocery store where he had bought bread and vegetables every morning for 50 years had been converted into a high-end wine bar. The building where he had lived in his youth, where he had raised his children, was gone. In its place was a modern apartment complex, all glass and steel. He found himself standing in front of it, leaning on his walker, trying to reconcile the memory of that building with the reality in front of him. "Excuse me," a young woman said, bumping into him slightly. She was dressed fashionably, carrying expensive bags. "Are you okay?" "This building," Marco said, pointing. "There was another building here, old, made of red brick." "I don't know," the young woman said, already losing interest. "This one has been here since I moved to Rome. That was 5 years ago." She walked away. Marco continued his walk, finding more changes. The neighborhood where generations of Romans like him had lived was being gentrified. The working-class residents were being pushed out, replaced by young professionals from Northern Europe and wealthy Italians from the north. It was still called Testaccio, but it wasn't his Testaccio anymore. Marco's son Marco came to visit from Milan. His son was now 54 years old, a successful engineer with a family of his own. He had 2 children, both in university. His wife was a doctor. They lived in a nice house in the suburbs of Milan. Marco Sr. felt like a stranger in front of his son. "Dad," Marco Jr. said, embracing him carefully, as if he might break. "It's good to see you awake." "It's good to see you," Marco Sr. responded. "You've gotten older." "We all have," Marco Jr. said with a sad smile. They sat in the small living room of the apartment, and Marco Jr. explained what had happened in his life over the past 20 years. University, marriage, children, career advancement, the purchase of a house, promotions. "I thought about you often," Marco Jr. said. "When I graduated, I wanted you there. When I got married, I wanted you there. When my children were born, I wanted you to meet them." "I'm sorry," Marco Sr. said. "It's not your fault," Marco Jr. replied. "But it happened, and we can't go back." They talked about the money. "Mom told me about the 5 million euros, Marco Jr. said. That's a lot of money, Dad. That could change everything." "What do you think your mother wants to do?" Marco Sr. asked. "I think she wants to pretend the money doesn't exist," Marco Jr. said. "She's been struggling for 20 years. She's built a life around struggle. She doesn't know how to live any other way." Marco's daughter Lucia visited the week after Marco Jr. left. She was 39 years old now. She had struggled with depression for most of her adult life, Marco learned. The accident, her father's coma, had affected her deeply during her formative years. She had dropped out of university. She had made poor choices. She had gotten divorced. She was now working as a receptionist at a dental office and raising her daughter Sophia alone. "I'm sorry," Lucia said when she first saw him awake. "I'm sorry I didn't visit more often. I couldn't handle seeing you like that. It made me feel like everything was broken." "You were just a child," Marco said. "You didn't have to handle anything." "But I felt like I did," Lucia said. "I felt like I was supposed to be strong for Mom, and I wasn't strong. I was a mess." They spent the afternoon talking. Lucia showed him pictures of Sophia. His granddaughter had his eyes, Lucia said. She was doing well in school. She wanted to be a lawyer. I want to give her things you didn't have, Lucia said. Opportunities, safety, stability. You can, Marco said. With the money you can. Lucia looked uncomfortable. I don't want your money, Dad, she said. I want you, Marco understood. The money was not the solution to what had been broken. Months passed and Marco continued to recover. His physical therapy was intense. His muscles slowly strengthened. His walking improved. Eventually he didn't need the walker anymore, though he still moved slowly and carefully, but his mental recovery was slower. He was plagued by a sense of guilt. Not for the accident. That had not been his fault. But for what his family had endured while he was gone. His wife had aged 20 years in his absence. His children had grown up without him. His grandchildren had never known their grandfather while he was conscious and present, and he had 5 million euros that could have prevented all of that suffering. He began to understand that the money was not a blessing. It was a curse. It was a reminder of what had been lost. It was guilt made concrete. He started having nightmares. In the dreams, he was awake the entire time. He could see and hear everything happening around him, but he couldn't move or communicate. He was trapped inside his own body for 20 years, aware but unable to help his family as they suffered. He saw a therapist. The therapist told him this was common in coma patients. The brain sometimes creates false memories, sometimes confabulates experiences. It was a way of processing trauma. The money is not your responsibility, the therapist told him. You didn't know it existed. You can't blame yourself for something you didn't know about. But Marco blamed himself anyway. 1 year after waking up, Marco called a family meeting. Isabella, Marco Jr., and Lucia all came to the small apartment. Marco had prepared coffee and biscuits, though his hands were still slightly shaky from the effort. I want to talk about the money, Marco began. Dad, you don't have to, Marco Jr. started, but Marco held up his hand. I do, Marco said. I need to, because this money is not mine. Not really. It's the price of what we lost. And I don't want to keep it as if it's some kind of prize. He pulled out a document that Antonella had prepared for him. I'm dividing it as follows, Marco said. 1 million to your mother. This is compensation for her 20 years of sacrifice. It's not enough. Nothing is enough. But it's what I can give. Isabella started to protest, but Marco continued. 2 million to each of you, you, Marco, and you, Lucia. For your children's education, for your security, for your futures. Marco Jr. and Lucia exchanged looks. And 1 million, Marco continued. I'm giving to a foundation that will help families of people in comas. To pay for care, to help with medical bills, to ensure that no one else has to suffer like your mother suffered. The room was silent. This is what I'm going to do with the money, Marco said. And I want you all to know that I'm not doing this because I'm a good man. I'm doing this because I can't carry the weight of it alone. Isabella stood up and left the room. The others could hear her crying in the bedroom. Marco Jr. put his hand on his father's shoulder. That's a good thing. Dad, he said quietly, the Marco Benedetti Foundation for Coma Care was established in 2024. It wasn't a large foundation. 1 million euros was not a fortune in the grand scheme of things, but it was enough to help dozens of families navigate the financial burden of caring for a loved one in a coma. Marco worked with Antonella to establish the foundation. He wrote about his experience. He spoke at conferences about the challenges of being a family member of someone in a coma. He became, unexpectedly, an advocate. Lucia, who had always struggled with direction, found purpose in helping her father with the foundation. She quit her job as a receptionist and became the foundation's coordinator. She worked with families directly, helping them understand their options, their rights, their resources. This is what I was supposed to do, Lucia told her father one day. I was supposed to struggle so I could understand what other people were struggling with. Marco Jr. helped with the legal and business aspects of the foundation. He ensured it was properly structured, properly managed, that the money was being used effectively. Isabella, despite her initial resistance, became involved too. She gave presentations about the emotional toll of having a spouse in a coma. She talked about the marriage that had to be rebuilt, the life that had to be reconstructed. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was connection. It was shared purpose. It was a way of transforming suffering into meaning. 3 years after Marco woke up, He was awarded a medal by the city of Rome for his humanitarian work. The ceremony was held at the Palazzo Senatorio on the Capitoline Hill. Politicians spoke. Community leaders spoke. The mayor of Rome presented Marco with a medal. Marco stood at the podium looking out at the audience, and he thought about the journey. From a mason in Testaccio to a comatose patient to a philanthropist, the path was not what he had chosen. It had been forced upon him by circumstance. "I spent 20 years unconscious," Marco said, his voice still slightly slurred but clear enough. "I woke up to a world I didn't recognize. My wife had aged. My children had grown up. My neighborhood had transformed. Nothing was as I had left it." He paused. "I could have spent my time being angry about what I had lost. I could have spent my money trying to recover the past. But I learned that the past cannot be recovered. It can only be honored." He looked at his family in the front row. "I created the foundation not to ease my guilt, though I hope it does that. I created it because I learned that suffering, when it's shared and processed and transformed into action, can become something meaningful." The audience applauded. After the ceremony, strangers came up to shake his hand. They told him their stories. They told him about loved ones in comas. They told him how the foundation had helped them. One woman, perhaps 60 years old, took his hand and didn't let go. "My husband has been in a coma for 8 years, she said. The foundation paid for a specialist to evaluate him. The doctor found something new. "My husband woke up last month." She was crying. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for creating something beautiful from your pain." Marco held her hand and felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness, not peace, but acceptance. Acceptance that his suffering had meaning. Acceptance that his life, even the parts that were broken, could contribute to healing others. 5 years after waking up, Marco could barely recognize himself. His hair had turned completely white. His face was lined with age and experience. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had been broken and remade, but his mind was sharp. His purpose was clear. He had transformed from a victim of circumstance into an agent of change. The foundation had expanded. There were now satellite offices in Milan, Naples, and Florence. They had helped over 500 families. Several people in comas had woken up because the foundation had funded research into their conditions. Several others had died peacefully, with their families at their sides, because the foundation had helped them navigate end-of-life decisions. Marco still lived in the small apartment in the outer neighborhoods of Rome. He had considered moving back to Testaccio with the remaining money, but he had decided against it. The neighborhood he had loved was gone. There was no point in trying to recover it. Instead, he spent his time with his family and his work. Isabella and Marco had not rekindled their romance. That ship had sailed, but they had rebuilt a companionship. They could sit together in silence without tension. They could laugh at memories without bitterness. They could move forward as co-parents and co-workers rather than as spouses. It wasn't the life either of them had imagined, but it was life. And Marco had learned that life was enough. Marco Jr. published a book about his father. It was titled The Man Who Woke Up 20 Years in Darkness, A Lifetime of Light. The book told the story of Marco's accident, his coma, his awakening, and the foundation he had created. It also told the story of the family members who had been left behind. It told the story of Isabella's sacrifice, of Lucia's struggle, of Marco Jr.'s guilt for not being able to do more. The book was not a commercial success. It sold moderately well in Italy. It was translated into English and published in the United States, where it had a modest following. But among medical professionals, social workers, and families dealing with comas, it became something of a Bible. It was required reading in many university programs on medical ethics and family dynamics. More importantly, it raised money for the foundation. The royalties from the book were donated to the foundation, which allowed it to expand even more. Marco read the book and wept. He wept for himself, for the life he had lost, for the years that could never be recovered, for the man he might have been if the scaffolding hadn't collapsed. But he also wept for the man he had become, for the purpose he had found in suffering, for the lives he had touched, for the families he had helped. On a Tuesday morning in October, Exactly 20 years after the scaffolding collapsed, Marco sat on a bench in a small park near his apartment. It was a beautiful day. The Roman autumn was mild and golden. The sun felt warm on his face. A breeze carried the smell of the Tiber River. Marco thought about awakening. He had awoken from a 20-year coma. But that wasn't the only awakening he had experienced. He had also awakened to the reality of what he had lost. He had awakened to the guilt of having money while his family suffered. He had awakened to the possibility of transforming suffering into meaning. And perhaps most importantly, he had awakened to the understanding that life is not about what we plan. Life is about what happens when our plans are destroyed and we have to rebuild from the rubble. A young woman sat down on the bench beside him. She had a toddler with her, maybe 2 years old. "Excuse me," the woman said. "My son is restless. I hope you don't mind if we sit here for a moment." "Not at all," Marco said. The little boy looked at Marco with curious eyes. Marco smiled at him. The boy smiled back and then buried his face in his mother's chest. "He's shy," the woman said. "My husband was hit by a car last year. He was in a coma for 3 months. He just woke up 2 weeks ago. The doctor said it was miraculous." Marco's heart skipped. "How is he?" Marco asked. "He's struggling," the woman said. "He lost 3 months of his life. He doesn't understand why the baby has grown so much. He doesn't understand how the world has changed. But he's alive, and every day he's getting better." "That's wonderful," Marco said. "I've been reading a book," the woman continued, "by a man named Marco Benedetti. He wrote about waking up from a coma, about learning to live again. It helped me understand what my husband is going through." Marco felt tears in his eyes. "I think that book is very wise," Marco said. "Do you know him?" the woman asked. "I do," Marco said. "I know him very well." The woman and her son left after a few minutes. Marco sat alone on the bench, watching the light change as the afternoon progressed. He thought about awakening, about how we wake up every morning and choose to continue living. How we wake up from grief and choose to find meaning. How we wake up from suffering and choose to transform it into something beautiful. He thought about his wife, still recovering from 20 years of being alone. He thought about his daughter, still finding her way. He thought about his son, still carrying the weight of being the responsible one. He thought about all the families the foundation had helped, all the people who had woken up, literally or figuratively, to the reality of their new lives. And he thought about the blessing and the curse of being alive. Being alive meant suffering. It meant losing things. It meant aging. It meant becoming unrecognizable to yourself and to others. But being alive also meant connection. It meant purpose. It meant the possibility of transformation. Marco stood up slowly, using a cane that he still needed for support even after 5 years of physical therapy. He walked toward home, his steps steady despite his age, despite his infirmity, despite everything he had lost. Because he had learned, in those 20 years of unconsciousness and the years that followed, that life is not measured by what we have. It is measured by what we do with what remains.